In this video, we are going to discuss the history of life on Earth, pointing out some major turning points in that history of life. We learned in Physics 112 on the solar system that the Earth formed from the primordial solar nebula roughly about 4.6 billion years ago. And for the majority of Earth's history, there has been life on Earth. Some of the earliest life forms on Earth were simple single-celled bacteria. Now, we do not have any fossils of these simple bacteria. These fossils, if they do exist, would be incredibly old, and these fossils will over time decay away as rocks move down into the crust and into the mantle and up and move around, and this would tend to destroy these fossil structures. But we do have evidence of early life on Earth from stromatolites. So to think about a stromatolite, how should we picture what's going on here? Imagine a bacteria in some relatively shallow water. Now, that bacteria may not want to be swept away into the ocean. That might not be good for it. So the bacteria could cling to a rock. And as that bacteria multiplies, you would begin to have a colony of bacteria clinging to this rock. And over time, you would have a mat of bacteria covering this rock. And as the bacteria colony grows, you would have successive layers as this mat of bacteria covering the rock gets thicker and thicker, and the mat covering the rock would grow upward. So eventually you would have some structures kind of like these stromatolites form. The oldest stromatolites on Earth have been dated to around 3.5 billion years old, so we know that there has been life on Earth for at least 3.5 billion years. But life might have existed on Earth for longer. There is reasonable evidence that stromatolites found in Greenland and northern Canada might be 3.74 billion years old, so life probably has been around for significantly longer. There is even evidence that the conditions that encourage the presence of life might have been around on Earth very, very soon after the formation of the Earth. So from looking at the isotopes of some incredibly old zircon crystals that formed very soon after the Earth formed 4.56 billion years ago, these crystals indicate that there was liquid water and a solid crust present. So the early Earth had a molten surface from the heat of planet formation right after the planet formed, but in order to have life, you have to have a solid surface and you have to have liquid water, as we discussed previously. So some of the conditions for life were present very soon after the formation of the Earth. So if this timeline shows the entire history of the Earth, here is the present day at 0, 1 billion years ago, 2 billion years ago, 3.5 billion years ago. We have very strong evidence of the existence of life on Earth. Evidence for stromatolites from northern Canada and Greenland around here 3.7 billion-ish years ago. And some of these Jack Hill zircon crystals that suggest the Earth had a solid surface and liquid water come from very soon after the formation of the Earth. So if we recall from Physics 112, the 4 stages of planetary formation, of world formation of the terrestrial worlds, the small rocky planets. Originally, the planet was just whatever, a big conglomerate of stuff, but then the planet's interior melted, the entire planet was liquid, and the heavier material sunk to the center while the lighter material floated to the surface. Now, normally when we think of rock, we don't necessarily think of rock as something that is light and would float, but you have to consider that the center of the Earth is iron and nickel, and rock, while it does sink in water, liquid rock would float if it is bathed in a sea of liquid metal. So rock is less dense than metal. Rock will float on a sea of metal. So the Earth differentiated and eventually cooled to form the crust and the mantle and the core. And then after that, there was the stage of heavy bombardment where planetesimals were colliding with all the objects in the solar system. And a lot of this heavy bombardment brought water to the Earth in the form of comets. After that, there was flooding. Lava would well up from below. And in addition, you had, as I said, water being brought to the Earth from comets. And this lava and water at different times would fill the low-lying areas of the planet. And then from the end of the flooding stage to present day, you just had your slow surface evolution, erosion, plate tectonics, all the stuff that gives these features of the Earth their character. These 4.4 billion year old zircon crystals do not offer proof that life existed on the Earth 4.4 billion years ago, but they offer evidence that some of the conditions necessary for life were present then. Two important conditions for life are the existence of a solid surface and the existence of liquid water. You need a solid surface because if you don't have a solid surface, well, then that means the surface of the Earth is a giant pool of lava, and you can't live in lava. Also, liquid water, we discussed in a previous video many reasons why we think water is important for life. So these crystals do strongly indicate that there was a solid crust and there was liquid water present on the Earth 4.4 billion years ago. If we think about planetary formation, the last stage of heavy bombardment ended around 3.9 billion years ago. So it was 3.9 billion years ago, and beyond that, you had the Earth being pummeled by asteroids and planetesimals from the early solar system. So it is not impossible that life arose on Earth multiple times, but before that life could spread out and become ubiquitous everywhere, that life just died out. If we look at the tree of life, we have all the different species that live on the Earth today, but if we go back and trace the lineages, eventually we end up at the last universal common ancestor, the Luca, as we described in some previous videos. But this Luca likely had its own ancestors from before. So this Luca is the last ancestor of everything alive today, but Luca had some ancestors. Some of those ancestors might have split off into other branches, but then something happened, whether the local environment changed or something else occurred. Maybe a giant meteor just fell on top of them that caused them to all die out. And with that in mind, it is not possible that life arose elsewhere on the Earth, but then before that life could spread out, maybe an asteroid or planetesimal fell on top of it, or something else occurred. Now, it would be incredibly difficult and possibly impossible to actually test this idea. So this is neat as a thought experiment and a possibility, but whether or not this actually occurred would be incredibly difficult to test because microorganisms, the very first things that were living that came from complex chemistry into simple biology, were really tiny single-celled organisms. And so these single-celled organisms would need to somehow leave a fossilized remain, which would be a big problem. And that fossilized remain would need to survive to today. So these microorganisms would need to, their fossils would be really tiny, but then the Earth's crust moves and rocks go under the crust and above. So these rocks could be destroyed if they fall down into the mantle and melt. And if you have a meteor fall on top of you, you're not even going to form a fossil in the first place. There is indirect evidence from isotopic abundances of carbon found in some possible stromatolite formation from Canada and Greenland that life existed further back around 4 billion years ago, beyond the 3.5 billion year number we quoted in a previous slide. This is not proof that life existed back then, but it is believed that living organisms are a very plausible explanation for the relative abundances of certain types of carbon that we see in these possibly stromatolite formations from Canada and Greenland. So if life began on the very early Earth, it may be reasonable to expect that life could develop easily, because if life could pop up as soon as the crust solidifies and water becomes present, well, that indicates that it is easy for life to develop. And if it's easy for life to develop on the Earth, then it is probably easy for life to develop elsewhere in the universe. And that suggests we would have better odds of finding life elsewhere in the universe. So some other significant milestones in the history of life on Earth. Living things need a source of energy to survive. Photosynthesis is a process where living things use energy from sunlight to make sugars out of simple molecules. Photosynthetic organisms seem to have existed on the Earth up to 3.2 to 3.5 billion years ago. So, sunlight might have been the original source of energy for living things, although in a future lecture we're going to discuss some other possibilities on what might have been the original source of energy for living things. Now, usually when we hear photosynthesis, we think of green plants. Green plants take in carbon dioxide, they combine that carbon dioxide with water and create simple sugars and release oxygen as a waste product. But the first photosynthesizing organisms did not release oxygen. At this time, there was no significant amount of oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere. As we discussed in Physics 112 when we were talking about the formation of the Earth's original atmosphere was very different from what it was today. It was the evolution of some bacteria that were able to combine carbon dioxide with water and release oxygen around 2.4-ish billion years ago was when oxygen actually first appeared in significant quantities in the Earth's atmosphere. And this is known as the Great Oxidation Event. So if we look at the entire timeline of the history of the Earth, from formation 4.56 billion years ago up until today, it was about halfway to the formation of the Earth that oxygen actually appeared in the Earth's atmosphere in a significant quantity. Now, by significantly altering the content of the Earth's atmosphere, many species died out during the Great Oxidation Event. But another thing that the Great Oxidation Event caused was the formation of an ozone layer. When the oxygen content of the atmosphere was about 0.1%, an ozone layer was able to form, and this was significant because ozone is a very effective molecule at blocking out harmful UV radiation that would come from the sun. So before the Great Oxidation Event, UV radiation could reach the surface of the Earth, and UV is a very high energy color of light, and if it strikes a complicated biological molecule, it would tend to break apart that biological molecule. And if you have this high energy light constantly breaking apart the biological molecules that form the cells, that's not very good for the cells. But with an ozone layer, the UV light was not really able to reach the surface of the Earth and damage the organic material and the living things on the Earth, and this allowed life to thrive. Another consequence of the Great Oxidation Event was it provided an opportunity for a large amount of biological diversification. Living things need to take in energy, and they need energy so they could do all the things that living things do. Now, oxygen is an incredibly reactive molecule, so an organism that could take in oxygen and use oxygen to help it survive and provide energy, well, oxygen provides a lot of energy to that molecule. So instead of having to solely focus on getting little bits of energy here and there, an organism that could take in oxygen could get a lot of energy, and by getting a lot of energy, it doesn't need to worry so much about getting little bits of energy here and there. And so because there is a ready source of energy all around you, then the organism is more likely to survive and able to branch out and do different things. And mutations that might have been fatal to previous generations when your source of energy was not so strong, now these mutations might survive and spread, and the biology of life on Earth might diversify very rapidly. Another important event in the history of life on Earth was the appearance of the eukaryotes. So the first eukaryotes appeared on Earth around 2 billion-ish years ago. So all life on Earth could be divided into prokaryotes or eukaryotes. Prokaryotes are simple single-celled organisms where their genetic material, their DNA that contains the blueprints of this living organism, just floats around the cell, not bonded to anything, and then you have a few other features of the cell. Eukaryotes contain all their genetic material inside a cell nucleus. And in addition, eukaryotes also have a more complicated cell structure. So you also have your endoplasmic reticulum and your lysosomes and your mitochondria. The great majority of unique species on Earth are prokaryotes. So, the majority of species on Earth are these simple single celled organisms with no nucleus. However, these organisms are just simple single celled organisms. Every living thing you have ever interacted with, you, your dog, trees, are some type of eukaryotes. Their cells are more complicated. The cells of eukaryotes are much more complex, and this increase in complexity allows the entities that are made up of eukaryotic cells to become more complex. Eukaryotes also contain mitochondria. Mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell, and these mitochondria produce energy for the cell to do all its cell things. The mitochondria likely were originally a bacteria that got eaten by a cell but then didn't quite die, and so the bacteria was producing energy that the cell that ate it was able to then use. So it ended up being a symbiotic relationship. And there's evidence of this today. Mitochondria have their own DNA in addition to the cell DNA inside of the cells of all living things that we interact with, all eukaryotic organisms. Now, at this point, all life on Earth has been just simple single-celled organisms, but at some point, multicellular life arose on Earth. So, when multicellular life arose on Earth, individual cells would be able to specialize and work to accomplish specific tasks for the benefit of an organism as a whole. This was beneficial because rather than every cell and having to perform every function that a living organism needs to accomplish, you're able to divide the labor. And so certain cells could focus on achieving certain tasks. So some advantages of multicellular life forms are multicellular life forms allowed organisms to become larger, and larger organisms have certain survival advantages. They're less likely to be eaten, for one. Also, multicellular life forms have longer lifespans. The death of a single cell in your stomach doesn't mean you are going to die. So if a few cells here and there could die off while the organism as a whole is able to continue on living. Also, as I said, multicellular life forms can become more complex. If you have certain cells accomplishing certain tasks, those cells don't need to do everything there is that needs to be done for a living organism to survive. So then you could divide up the labor, and the organism could then become more complex and have structures within it. So consider multicellular life in the context of the video Emergence that we watched from a previous lecture, and two videos that we're going to watch after this lecture. The momentous transition to multicellular life may not have been so hard after all, and what are you? And this amalgamation of muscle cells, bone cells, nerves, blood cells, cells in your immune system, cells in your nervous system, all of these individual living organisms combine to form you, however you want to define what you are. Multicellular life might have arisen as early as 3 billion years ago, although it's not exactly clear when it arose. There are 2.1 billion year old fossils of large organisms, but these fossils might just be colonies of bacteria, and the transition from a colony of many bacteria that are individually their own entity versus multicellular life is a bit hazy. Multicellular life did seem to evolve independently several times in the history of life on Earth. It evolved to form animals, plants, fungi. Recent research suggests that single-celled organisms evolving into multicellular organisms might not really be that difficult to accomplish. Some of the earliest animal multicellular organisms were sea sponges, and separately you had algae evolving from single-celled organisms into multicell organisms for the first multicellular plants, and also various funguses also evolved from single-cell fungi to multicellular fungi. Sex. The earliest simple organisms on Earth reproduced asexually. During asexual reproduction, an organism creates a copy of itself. So basically you have a simple cell that splits into two simple cells. Now, aside from an occasional random mutation, The offspring, the next generation, is going to be identical to the previous generation. During sexual reproduction, organisms share their genetic material together. So the offspring will contain traits of the previous generation, but the offspring will be unique and different compared to the previous generation. Now, as you have sexual reproduction and the offspring and subsequent generations are going to be much more different than the previous generations, and this allows for a rapid diversification of organisms. And as organisms spread out and move to different niches within their environment, some traits might be favored versus other traits. And those traits will tend to be acquired by the organisms that survive better, and those organisms will then survive to reproduce more often. And you have ultimately this diversification of species that are more suited to different environments. So, and you have a rapid diversification of different types of species due to sexual reproduction. After reproduction, the male mantis provides the female mantis with a nice meal. Since the origin of life on Earth more than 3.5 billion years ago, and for the majority of the history of life on Earth, life was relatively simple. There was some degree of complexity of life on Earth. There were nucleuses in the cells, there were multicellular organisms, but compared to today, life was much simpler back then. However, about 540 million years ago, there was a sudden explosion in the degree of complexity and the diversity of different life forms on the Earth, and this was known as the Cambrian explosion. Almost every group of modern animal alive today appeared originally during this sudden increase in biodiversity. Pretty much every animal that is alive today could trace its ancestors back to the Cambrian explosion, when the different types of species on Earth just really diverged to form the wide variety of species on Earth today. Another important milestone in the history of life on Earth was when life moved on to the land. Up until this point in this lecture, all life on Earth lived in the water. All life was aquatic. However, around 470 million years ago, plants first took a permanent residence on the land, and sometime around 440 to 410 million years ago, animals began to live permanently on the land as well. Now, animals would occasionally scurry out of the water and scurry around on the land a little bit. Possibly they would lay eggs on land, so the eggs could be away from predators in the water. But the animals would go back into the water. They did not permanently live on the land. So, about 470 million years ago, the very first land plants were likely simple algae, but over time they would evolve to form a wide variety of different species of plants on land. And shortly thereafter, and when I say shortly after, I mean shortly in geological time, some fish scurried out of the water, and these fish somewhat resembled salamanders. They would scurry around with their fins on the land. These fish salamander things known as Tiktaalik then were the first species of animal life that lived permanently on the land after the insects. Now, from these fish would eventually evolve amphibians, reptiles, and mammals. We see evidence of this from the fossil record. If you look at the bone structure of Tiktaalik fossils and compare them to later on animals that lived on the land, you could see the evolution of how these fins eventually evolved into feet that were capable of running around on the land. And through natural selection, animals that had structures that more resembled feet rather than fins could do better in their environment. Fins are good if you're in the water. They're not really helpful if you're on land. So over time, these fins evolved into feet, and by following the bone structure through the fossil record, we're able to posit that these fish eventually evolved into the ancestors that would eventually become amphibians and split off through the tree of life into reptiles, mammals, and other species of animals that live on the land. There have also been mass extinctions in the Earth's history. There have been 5 mass extinctions in the Earth's past, and a mass extinction is an event where many species on Earth disappear suddenly. Again, when I say disappear suddenly, I mean many species on Earth die out in a matter of a few thousand or possibly as long as 1 million years. But compared to geological time, it's many species dying out very quickly. The most famous mass extinction was the asteroid or comet that struck the modern day Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico that killed the dinosaurs. So, at the end of the Cretaceous period, a comet or asteroid hit the northwestern Yucatan Peninsula. This collision kicked up a lot of dust into the atmosphere. This altered the climate of the Earth. And as a consequence of this, about 3/4 of all species on Earth went extinct. In the Earth's history, there have been 5 major mass extinction events where many species disappear suddenly. The largest of these mass extinctions was referred to as the Great Dying, and it occurred about 250 million years ago. The cause of this mass extinction event was a lot of volcanism in what is modern day Siberia. So, when I say a lot of volcanism, I mean an area comparable to the size of the lower 48 states of the entire United States was covered in lava. This volcanic activity released a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which in turn caused the ocean temperature to rise and the climate to get warmer, and the oceans became more acidic. And in the end, this caused about 95% of all species on Earth to die off. At present, the Earth is beginning to go through a 6th mass extinction, and this mass extinction is caused by human activity. The main drivers of this mass extinction are habitat destruction and ocean acidification. Changing weather patterns, climate change will alter the habitats, and if a species is not able to survive in what its new habitat becomes, that species will die off. Also, human encroachment into otherwise pristine areas of the natural world also affect habitats. As far as ocean acidification, climate change makes the air warmer and it makes the ocean temperature rise. As there is more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, more carbon dioxide is going to be absorbed into the ocean. Oceans absorb carbon dioxide and lay down the limestone sediment at the bottom of the ocean eventually. However, if the oceans become more acidic, that is very bad for simple plants like phytoplankton, and anything that in the ocean that relies on a shell will do poorly with ocean acidification. Phytoplankton produce more than half the oxygen we breathe. They're the base of the marine food web. Anything that has a shell is also an important piece of the ocean food web. Also, with habitat destruction, species that live in warmer waters can migrate closer to the poles to move towards cooler waters, but species in the high oxygen environment of the cooler waters near the poles don't have anywhere to go. There is no colder water for them to go if they're already at the poles, so they die off. So here are a number of videos that are all linked to in the playlist for PHY 114. Watch them, and then I will see you in the next video.